spoke the tongues of the dead, the haunting case of Janice Fox. In 1873, in a cramped Victorian cottage in rural England, a 12-year-old girl opened her mouth and destroyed the lives of everyone around her. She didn't have a weapon. She didn't need one. She spoke, and what came out of her was not the voice of a child. It was the voice of something older, something that had been waiting. Witnesses described languages no living person could identify. Scholars who heard her grow pale, a midwife who fainted, a professor who, hours after listening to her, took his own life, and a family, an entire family, who simply vanished. Her name was Janice Fox, and to this day, no one can say with certainty what she was: a fraud, a prodigy, a broken girl with a broken mind, or something the Victorian world had no words for. This is her story. To understand Janice Fox, you have to understand where she came from. She was born sometime around 1861. The exact year is unclear, as was common for children born into poverty in rural England. She was one of 9 children, 9 mouths, 1 hearth, and a father who worked the mines. The Fox cottage sat on the edge of a small farming village, narrow, timbered, the kind of home where the walls held the cold in winter and the heat suffocated you in summer. The roof leaked, the fire smoked, and on most nights, the children slept pressed together like stacked firewood just to stay warm. By all accounts, Janice was unremarkable. Neighbors who were later interviewed recalled her as quiet, pale, the kind of child who blended into the background of a crowded room without effort. She didn't attend school. Her family couldn't afford it. She spent her days helping her mother with chores, watching her siblings fight, and sitting near the fire, staring into the flames. No one gave her a second thought. That was the first mistake. Her mother, a deeply religious woman, ran the household with a combination of scripture and exhaustion. Her father rarely spoke of his days underground. Whatever he saw in the mines, he kept it there. There was nothing in Janice Fox's life to suggest what was coming. No strange dreams reported, no episodes of violence, no history of illness, no family legacy of madness, at least none that were recorded. She was ordinary in the way that a quiet lake is ordinary before the thing beneath the surface breaks through. And then, one evening in the winter of 1872, the surface broke. The first incident happened on an evening like any other. Janice was seated by the fire. Her mother was darning clothes nearby. Her brothers were bickering about something inconsequential. The cottage smelled of smoke and boiled cabbage and damp wool. And then Janice lifted her head. Her eyes rolled upward, not in a dramatic, theatrical way, but slowly, mechanically, the way a clock face might turn. And then she opened her mouth. What came out was not her voice. It was deeper, guttural, deliberate, each syllable placed carefully like stones across a dark river. Her mother froze with her needle mid-stitch. The brothers stopped arguing. No one in that room recognized a single word. Her mother would later describe it as a foreign tongue, but not one she could place. Not French, not German. Her eldest brother, who had spent time working the London docks and had heard sailors speaking in a dozen languages, said it was older than anything he knew, something that seemed, in his own words, to echo in the bones. And then Janice began to say things that should have been impossible. She described the death of a child in the next parish, a death that had not yet been reported to their village. She spoke of a neighbor's secret sin, something so specific and private that the neighbor, when told, reportedly refused to leave her house for 3 days. And then she spoke of a locked drawer, her father's locked drawer, the one no one in the household had ever been permitted to open. She described its contents in precise detail. Her father said nothing. He walked outside. He didn't come back in until long after Janice had gone quiet. The family did what most deeply religious families of the era would do. They went to their parish priest. He told them to keep it quiet, to pray, to resist what he called the temptation to make meaning of something that was likely illness. But silence, as it turned out, was impossible. Word spread the way all dangerous things do in small communities. First, it was a whisper between neighbors. Then it was a story shared over fences and at market stalls. Within weeks, visitors began arriving at the Fox cottage, curious villagers, then strangers from neighboring towns, then people who had heard the story from someone who had heard it from someone else. They all wanted the same thing. They wanted to see the girl, and Janice, to the mounting horror of her parents, did not disappoint. The episodes became more frequent, more intense, more impossible to explain away. When the trances came, she would grow rigid. Her eyes would go glassy, fixed on something not in the room. Her lips would tremble, and then the voice would come. Sometimes it was the voice of a child, sometimes a man, and sometimes it was something so low, so distorted, that those present described it as inhuman, as though the sound was being processed through a body not designed to carry it. She spoke Latin fluently, a girl who had never sat in a classroom, never held a book, never been taught so much as her own alphabet, speaking Latin with the precision of a scholar. She spoke what some observers believed to be fragments of Greek, and there was something else. A third language, one that no one in any room could identify. Scholars who later examined written transcriptions of her utterances described it as archaic, pre-classical perhaps. One wrote in his private notes that it resembled no known living or dead language, and yet felt somehow familiar in the way that a half-remembered dream feels familiar, as though they had heard it before birth. But it was the revelations that truly shook people. A midwife fainted, collapsed completely, when Janice repeated, word for word, a confession the woman had once whispered to a dying man decades prior. A confession the midwife had told no one. A moment she had believed she had taken to her grave. A farmer's wife burst into tears when Janice recited the lullaby she had sung to her dead infant. A local schoolteacher left the county and never returned. Each revelation was too precise, too intimate, too far outside the realm of what a 12-year-old girl from a poor farming family could have gathered through gossip or observation. The skeptics had explanations: cold reading, fraud, a family looking for money and attention, an elaborate performance by a child who had learned to read people. But the believers had something the skeptics didn't. They had been in the room. Let's stop here for a moment, because it would be irresponsible not to ask the obvious question. Was Janice Fox a fraud? The Victorian era was the golden age of spiritualism. Seances were fashionable, mediums were everywhere, families grieving the extraordinary death toll of industrialization, disease, and poverty were desperate for connection to their lost loved ones, and there was no shortage of people willing to exploit that desperation. Cold reading, the technique of making calculated guesses based on visible cues, then building on whatever the subject confirms, was widely practiced, even if it wasn't named yet. A clever observer could gather remarkable amounts of personal information simply by watching how people dressed, moved, reacted. And Janice's family was poor. Her father was in debt. By 1873, spiritualist circles in London had begun whispering her name. Letters arrived at the Fox cottage inviting the family to bring Janice to drawing rooms and parlors where seances were held. Her father, weary from debt, reluctantly agreed. There it was, the financial motive. Skeptics pointed to it immediately. The family was being paid. The exhibitions were performances. The languages were gibberish dressed up to sound ancient. The revelations were fed to Janice in advance. It was a reasonable theory, except the scholars who tested her weren't credulous spiritualists. They were academics, linguists, physicians, men trained specifically not to be fooled. They brought books in dead languages and watched her read aloud from pages she had never touched. They whispered confessions silently in their own minds, and Janice spoke them back. One doctor, deeply committed to finding a rational explanation, spent 3 days in close observation of Janice. He arrived certain he would uncover the mechanism of the fraud. He left without writing a single note of debunking. He did, however, write one letter to a colleague. In it, he described the experience as, in his own words, the single most disturbing event of my professional life. He never explained further. He never published. And he never agreed to discuss Janice Fox again. Something else was happening to Janice, something her family noticed before anyone else did. She had stopped eating, not in the way of illness. She didn't grow thin. She didn't weaken. She simply didn't eat. Days would pass with no food consumed, and yet she remained the same weight, the same energy, as though she was drawing sustenance from somewhere else. She stopped sleeping too. Her mother, who watched her through the night on several occasions, reported that Janice would lie still in her bed with her eyes open. Not closed in rest, open, staring at the ceiling for hours, unblinking, unmoving. And yet by morning she would rise as though fully refreshed, and her hair, once pale, the faded, nondescript blonde of a malnourished rural child, it began to darken, slowly at first, then unmistakably. By the time of the London exhibitions, it was described by multiple witnesses as nearly black, as though, one journalist wrote uncomfortably, her very substance was being altered by whatever inhabited her. And then there were the marks. Small bruises appeared on her arms, shaped like fingers, but no hand had touched her, not in any moment her mother had witnessed. Scratches appeared across her back overnight, deep, parallel, as though drawn by something deliberate. Her mother examined her every morning. There was never an explanation. There was never a moment anyone could point to and say, that's when it happened. It simply appeared as though Janice Fox was being used, as though something was wearing her body the way a person pulls on a coat, slipping in, making its presence known through her skin, and then retreating before anyone could catch it. And then came the night in Bath. It was an evening gathering, a private drawing room in the city of Bath. Oil lamps, dark wood paneling, a room full of scholars, professors, physicians, a linguist from Oxford, and 2 men whose names were never formally recorded in any surviving document. Janice was brought in looking exhausted. She sat in a chair. Her hands lay limp at her sides. Her eyes were barely open. For several minutes, nothing happened. The scholars exchanged glances. Some began to suspect the evening was a waste of their time. And then Janice whispered a name. It was the name of one of the professors present. She turned her head toward him, and she described in precise detail the layout of his private chambers, a home he had never publicly discussed. The desk near the eastern window, the books arranged by date of acquisition, not author, and a specific drawer. A drawer where he kept a revolver and a letter. A letter, she said quietly, that he had written the previous night, confessing his despair. The room went silent. The professor had gone white. He sat perfectly still. He did not confirm. He did not deny. He simply stared at Janice Fox with an expression that those present would later, in private letters and journals, describe as recognition, as though she had said something he had been waiting his whole life to have said back to him. The evening ended without ceremony. Hours later, the professor returned to his chambers. He used the revolver. In the aftermath, the room fractured along predictable lines. Some said Janice had driven him to it, that she had reached into his darkest privacy and exposed it, weaponizing his despair. Others said she had only revealed what was already written, that the professor had already decided, that Janice had simply known. But a third group, smaller, quieter, unwilling to be named, said something else entirely. They said she hadn't revealed the contents of a private mind. They said she had read something that hadn't happened yet. They said the letter had not yet been written when Janice first opened her mouth. That she had described a document that, at the moment of her speaking, did not yet exist. No one could prove it. No one tried very hard. The Fox family withdrew Janice from public life within weeks of the bath incident. They returned to their cottage. Visitors were turned away, curtains stayed drawn, and the whispers began again, but different this time. Darker. Neighbors reported pale candlelight burning through the Fox windows at all hours of the night. Strange voices carried on the wind, not one voice, many, dozens perhaps, as though the cottage had become a vessel for something that could not be contained. One farmer, passing late at night on the road beside the property, reported hearing what he described as a chorus, voices layered over each other in languages he couldn't name. He stopped his cart. He stood in the road for several minutes, listening. He said it sounded like the dead trying to be heard. And then, in early spring of 1874, the Fox family vanished. All of them, father, mother, 9 children, including Janice. No farewell, no forwarding address, no sale of the property. The cottage stood open. Chickens wandered untended. Tools rusted in the yard. A pot of something remained on the hearth, long since burned to nothing. Searches were conducted by local authorities. No bodies were found. No trail was followed to any conclusion. The Fox family had simply dissolved into rumor, into mist, into the kind of story people tell in hushed voices and then immediately regret telling. And that should have been the end of Janice Fox. But it wasn't. A year after the family's disappearance, a London asylum recorded the admission of a young girl, approximately 13 years old, no name given, no family present. She had been found in a state of agitation on a city street, muttering continuously in what attendants described as languages they could not place. She had no papers. When asked her name, she gave only one reply, whispered through cracked lips, "I am many." She remained in that asylum for years, fading into obscurity, listed in records as unknown. When she died, no parish record noted her burial, no stone was raised, no name was carved. She disappeared twice, once from the world and once from memory. What are we left with? Fragments, testimonies, the private letters of men who refused to publish what they witnessed, medical notes that describe something their authors clearly struggled to categorize, a trail of people who, one by one, chose silence over explanation. Was Janice Fox a skilled fraudster? A child who had, through some extraordinary combination of observation and intuition, learned to simulate the impossible? Possibly. Was she suffering from a dissociative condition, a fragmented identity, producing multiple voices and personalities, misinterpreted by a credulous Victorian public as something supernatural? Also possible. Or was she something the 19th century had no clinical language for? A child who, through some process no one has been able to name, became a conduit, a vessel, a door that opened onto something vast and dark and indifferent, something that spoke through her the way a ventriloquist speaks through a puppet, borrowing her voice, wearing her body, slowly consuming whatever had been Janice Fox before it arrived. We don't know. We may never know. What we do know is this. Somewhere in the archives of forgotten medical journals and spiritualist tracts, her story persists, copied by hand, passed between scholars who weren't supposed to be interested, filed under headings like anomalous cases and unexplained phenomena, the Victorian equivalent of a file labeled, "We don't want to talk about this." And if you believe the whispers, her voice can still be heard. Soft, cold, endless. Whenever a child speaks words they should not know. The case of Janice Fox raises questions that the Victorian world refused to answer and that our world still hasn't fully confronted. What do we do with evidence we cannot explain? What do we do with witnesses who have nothing to gain from lying? What do we do when the rational explanation fits, but doesn't quite cover everything? If you found this story unsettling, that's the point. The most disturbing true crime isn't always about blood and evidence and courtrooms. Sometimes it's about a quiet girl sitting by a fire and the voice that came out of her mouth. If you want more stories like this, cases that sit at the edge of history, where the documented and the inexplicable collide, subscribe. We cover the cases that other channels won't touch. And if you think you know what Janice Fox really was, leave it in the comments.